It was meant to be a clean, patriotic panel, an American governor, a foreign military leader, and a crowd ready to hear about shared values. That was the phrase Kristi Noem repeated before going on stage. Shared values. The producers at the International Summit had chosen her to represent American strength. What they hadn't anticipated was that she'd face a man who didn't come to nod politely. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had been invited, last minute after a viral speech he gave at the African Sovereignty Forum. His presence sparked controversy before he even arrived in Washington, D.C. The Western press painted him as a populist strong man. The African youth called him a symbol of resistance. Kristi Noem saw him as a problem. From the moment they sat on opposite sides of the stage, the tension was electric. The moderator smiled, oblivious. Governor Noem, Captain Traoré, thank you both for being here. Today's topic is freedom and order in a changing world. Kristi spoke first, polished, confident. Let me be clear, she said, scanning the crowd. America leads because we set the standard. We don't just talk about freedom, we protect it. But we can't pretend every culture plays by the same rules. Civilization has costs, and not everyone's willing to pay them. It was a veiled jab, but everyone knew who it was aimed at. Trop sat still, eyes steady. Captain, the moderator said, turning to him. Would you like to respond? Traoré didn't hesitate. Freedom, he said calmly, should not be measured by how many McDonald's you can open or how fast you can access Netflix. In my country, freedom is the right to resist foreign puppets and build a nation without begging for permission. The crowd stirred. Kristi leaned in, her tone sharpening. Sounds noble. But let's not confuse rebellion with civilization. Some of us had to fight to bring order to chaos. Others seemed to enjoy living in it. The room fell quiet. Traoré turned his head slowly. His voice was colder now. You say we live in chaos, he said. But maybe the only real chaos is a system that wears a suit while stealing. The moderator's smile faded. The storm had started, and neither of them was backing down. There was a shift in the air, something heavier than disagreement. It wasn't just political anymore, it was personal. Kristi Noem had stepped into the debate, expecting a confrontation of ideas. What she got was a direct challenge to her sense of identity, her worldview, and perhaps most threatening, her authority. She straightened her posture, her voice now tinged with ice. You talk about stealing, she said, looking squarely at Traoré. Let's be honest. The only thing the world's ever taken from regimes like yours is instability. You call it sovereignty, we call it regression. There were murmurs in the audience. Some leaned forward. Others leaned back. Traoré smiled, not arrogantly, but as if to say, you just stepped into the fire. He didn't raise his voice. You mistake your presence for progress. He said, you come to our lands with aid in one hand and contracts in the other. You build bases before you build schools. And when we call it out, you say we're ungrateful. Kristi's eyes narrowed. It's called structure. Something your region desperately needs. That was it. Leaned forward now, not out of anger, but out of precision. You wear order like a mask, he said, but underneath it, exploitation. Your structure is built on silence. Ours, your peace comes from controlling the narrative. And when we finally speak, you call us uncivilized. The moderator shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Kristi shot back, his burning flags, overthrowing governments, banning journalists. How exactly is that civil? Trop answered instantly. Civil when you topple elected leaders through sanctions and bribes? Civil when your corporations mine our land and leave our people in debt? Right? Laws with white gloves while your hands stay bloody. There was no applause, just raw, stunned quiet. And then came the moment that would trend worldwide. Kristi, her voice sharp and full of disdain, turned to him and said, loud enough for every microphone, you're Uncivilized. The words dropped like a hammer. Without blinking, Traoré turned to face her directly and replied, you're unmasked. That was it. The audience erupted, not with cheers, but with a surge of energy, noise, disbelief. Phones came out, tweets flew. The clip would be replayed in newsrooms, classrooms, and war rooms around the globe. And on that stage, one truth had been made clear. This was no longer a debate. It was a reckoning. The room didn't recover. For several seconds, it was just noise. Shocked, gasps, camera shutters, whispers between diplomats who hadn't expected this kind of heat at a public summit. Even the moderator looked frozen, his cue cards limp in his hands. Kristi Noem broke the silence first, her voice slower this time, measured but sharp. "You think you can shame me with your slogans?" she said, shaking her head. "You parade on these stages with accusations, but no accountability. You scream about Western exploitation, yet your people still line up for visas. You criticize our systems, yet you rely on our medicine, our banks, our technology." Traoré listened quietly. Then he nodded once, as if she had unknowingly handed him the perfect opening. "I don't blame you for believing that," he said. "You were raised in a house of mirrors. You think reflection is reality." The crowd leaned in again. "We line up for visas," he continued, "because you broke our economies and then told us to come clean your homes. We use your medicine because your labs patented our herbs and sold them back to us. We bank with your institutions because you made sure we had no others." Kristi leaned back, her smile brittle. "So, you're the victim now?" Traoré's expression didn't change. "No," he said firmly. "I'm the result." There it was again. One of those lines that didn't need volume, carried weight because it couldn't be denied. "You act as if history began when you walked in," he added. "As if civilization only started when your flag arrived. But we had law before you had plumbing. We had harmony before you drew borders. And we had pride before you introduced shame." A hush spread across the hall. A few attendees, ambassadors, activists, even military officers, were no longer neutral. You could see it in their eyes. Kristi, sensing she was losing the room, switched tactics. "You're romanticizing a broken system," she said. "Your people are still poor, still suffering, still dying under your watch. So forgive me if I don't take moral lectures from someone who can't even keep the lights on in his own country." That one got a reaction. Some nods, a few uncomfortable claps, but Traoré stood up not to walk away, to speak louder. "Let me be clear," he said. "We don't need your pity. We need you to stop pretending your hands are clean while standing on the ashes of what you helped destroy." There was no script for this moment, and now the world was watching without filters. The summit had officially lost control of the narrative. What was supposed to be a discussion on shared values had become a global confrontation between sanitized power and raw, unapologetic truth. And Traoré, still standing, was no longer just a panelist. He was a storm in uniform. Kristi Noem adjusted her mic, her voice lower now, but still cold. "You keep blaming the West for everything. At some point, don't you have to own your failures?" Traoré nodded slightly, but his gaze never softened. "I do own them," he said, "and we are changing them. But what I will not do, what I refuse to do, is pretend that your success wasn't built on our destruction." Kristi smirked, arms folded. "That's convenient." "No," he replied. "It's documented." The audience was no longer quiet out of politeness. They were quiet because no one knew what would come next. "You want to talk about failure?" Traoré continued. "Let's talk about countries whose greatest export is war, who destabilize regions with one hand and then offer peace talks with the other. You want to measure civilization by GDP and infrastructure, but not by how many cultures you erase to build them." He paused. "It's just long enough for the words to settle. Your stability is built on our silence," he said. "And now that we're speaking, suddenly we're the threat." Kristi narrowed her eyes. "You think this is speaking truth? This is propaganda wrapped in poetry." "No," he said sharply. "This is what truth sounds like when it's no longer asking for permission." Moderator finally stepped in, trying to salvage what he could. Let's redirect," he said nervously.
"Apps.
"We can find common ground. Shared challenges." Traoré didn't even look at him. "There can be no common ground," he said, "between the one who holds the whip and the one who bears the scars." The line sucked the air out of the room. Kristi stood now, arms by her sides, visibly rattled. So what's your endgame, Captain? You want to isolate yourselves? Burn bridges? Turn your back on the international community? Tro looked up at her, calm as ever. We're not burning bridges, he said. We're just tired of being the ones expected to kneel on them. Flashbulbs went off. Phones caught every second. And in that moment, it was clear this wasn't just a disagreement. It was a rupture. And no amount of diplomacy could cover the crack. Trao had split wide open. The International Summit Hall was now a furnace of tension. Had begun as a staged conversation for the cameras had morphed into something dangerous, unscripted truth. Kristi Noem stood tall, hands clenched. Her political instincts told her she was losing the optics. This wasn't a campaign crowd. This wasn't Fox News. This was the world watching in real time. And Trao was flipping the script. She stepped forward and spoke through her teeth. You want to rewrite history? You want to erase the good we've done all in the name of victimhood? Trop didn't blink. History doesn't need to be rewritten, he said. It needs to be read fully, not just the parts that flatter your flag. The crowd responded, not with claps, but with breathless stillness. Kristi pressed harder. What exactly do you want, Captain? You reject our aid. You insult our leadership. You disrespect our alliances. So what's your goal? A world where there's no order, no rules, just chaos led by men like you? Trout's voice dropped, but his tone turned sharp. You think we want your throne? He asked. We don't. He paused. Let the silence hang. We want you off it. Gasps echoed. A few diplomats shifted in their seats. The moderator dropped his pen. You don't get to dominate the table and then accuse us of flipping it when we finally... Stan Traoré continued. We are not seeking vengeance. We're demanding space. Kristi was visibly shaken now, no longer composed. You come here pretending to speak for justice, she snapped. But your version of justice smells a lot like resentment. Tro stepped closer. His presence was heavy, but controlled. It's not resentment, he said. It's remembrance. And you're uncomfortable, because we remember things your system depends on us forgetting. He turned slightly to face the crowd, not just her. You called me uncivilized. But let me ask, what is civilization that bombs before it builds, that lectures before it listens, that takes without asking? He pointed gently to the floor of the summit stage, called us a seat at the table, but you never asked if we were hungry, only if we were obedient. The silence after his words wasn't stunned, it was surrendered. In 5 short exchanges, Traoré had flipped centuries of narrative. And Kristi, Noem, for all her practice power, found herself no longer speaking from above, but defending herself. From across, by now, the summit had stopped being a diplomatic event and become something raw, a global confessional. The audience wasn't just listening. They were confronting their own positions, their own complicity. Kristi Noem, trying to regain footing, turned to the crowd instead of facing Traoré directly. Let's be clear, she said, her voice forceful again. America's influence has stabilized regions, liberated nations, and empowered millions, men and women alike. We don't always get it right, but we don't apologize for leading. Some scattered applause broke out, mostly from predictable seats, career diplomats, U.S. allies, NGO representatives. But the claps didn't carry. Traoré let them finish. And with a voice low and sharp, he said, You don't apologize for leading, because you've never admitted what you've destroyed. The words came out like ice. This isn't diplomacy, he continued. This is exposure. You wear words like freedom and democracy like armor. But when we say them, you call us radicals. When we defend ourselves, you call it aggression. When we refuse your terms, you call us unstable. He paused, let it sink in. Your entire model of peace, he added, requires our silence and your spotlight. Kristi stepped forward, frustration now leaking into her voice. You want us gone? Fine, but don't come running when your borders fall, when your people suffer, when your enemies rise. Traoré raised his head, not in defiance, but in unshakable calm. We're already suffering, he said, not because we stood alone, but because we stood behind you. And the only thing worse than suffering is suffering for someone else's image. A murmur ran through the hall. This wasn't rhetoric. It was a dismantling. Kristi's last card was emotional authority. "You think I don't care?" she said. "You think we sit in rooms like this and sleep easy knowing people are in pain?" Traoré tilted his head, measured her words, and responded, "No. I think you sleep because you've convinced yourself the pain is necessary." That line didn't draw applause. It drew realization. And in that moment, Kristi Noem wasn't just standing across from a soldier. She was standing across from a man holding a mirror, and the reflection wasn't kind. The silence was no longer awkward. It was charged. Viewers around the world were glued to their screens. Commentators already drafting hot takes, news outlets preparing headlines. But in that room, in real time, the illusion of politeness had fully shattered. Kristi Noem folded her arms, clearly done with decorum. "You speak of pain like you invented it," she snapped. "You think America has no scars. We've bled for freedom. We've sacrificed for peace, and we've done more to uplift this world than any empire in history." Traoré nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of her words. Then he replied, not with fire, but with precision. "You bled," he said. "But you chose where. You chose when. And more often than not, you bled on land that wasn't yours." Kristi flinched, not visibly, but inwardly, her hands gripped tighter. "You uplifted some," he continued, "and buried others. You speak of sacrifice, but it was always yours to offer." Myers was taken. The audience felt it. Some in the front row shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to applaud or remain still. Traoré took a step forward, not in aggression, but in presence. "You confuse control with care," he said. "You show up with aid after the damage. You host conferences after the extraction. You fund campaigns after the chaos." Kristi raised a hand, trying to cut him off. "No, we show up because we're needed. When things fall apart, who do they call?" Traoré said calmly. "Because you're the ones who broke it." Gasps again. This time, fewer attempted to hide it. "You've turned crisis into currency," he said. "And every time we stand on our own feet, you pull the ground beneath them and say, 'See, you need us.'" Kristi's voice dropped to a near whisper, more real now. "Then what do you want from us?" Traoré didn't hesitate. "Nothing," he said. "The part you can't accept?" He looked to the crowd. "We don't want charity. We don't want lectures. We want to stop being interrupted." The crowd's stillness deepened. "You've told your story for centuries," he said. "Now we're telling ours." For the first time since the confrontation began, Kristi Noem had no comeback. Deep down, she understood something terrifying. She was no longer the narrator. Storm didn't need lightning to make itself known. Sometimes it came with stillness, the kind that followed when the air had already been ripped open. That's where the room now sat, in the uneasy silence that follows a truth no one wanted to face. Kristi Noem's silence wasn't weakness. It was calculation. But in that pause, in the milliseconds she hesitated, the entire room had shifted. She no longer looked like the host of civilization. She looked like a guest in someone else's awakening. She took a breath. "You've made your point," she said, words slow and deliberate. "But standing on a stage and accusing us of everything doesn't fix your region. It doesn't power your grid or stop your wars." Traoré turned his head slightly, not angry, steady. "No," he said, "but it stops yours from being the only voice in the room." Kristi didn't reply, so he continued. "You don't fix what you refuse to look at. You've spent decades shaping the narrative. Who's civilized? Who's not? Who deserves help? Who deserves sanctions? Who is labeled stable? Who gets called dangerous?" He stepped closer. "Not confrontational, just unmistakable. Your voice was never the only one," he said. "Just the loudest." A ripple moved through the crowd. Kristi, searching for control, fell back on the flag. "We've done more good than harm. We've lifted nations, built roads, educated girls, fought extremism." "You've done all that?" Traoré interrupted, gently, with cameras watching. A pause. "You liberated when it benefited you. You funded education when it aligned with your politics. You fought extremism with bombs and then asked us to sweep up the rubble. She clenched her jaw. You think we're the enemy? No, he said. You think you're the savior. That hit harder than any insult. And then Trey delivered the line that would make international headlines. We're not your project. We're not your burden. We're not your unfinished story. We are the voices you silenced in your textbooks, finally learning how to write our own. The hall was stunned. Not one person moved, because for the first time in that room, power wasn't determined by title, wealth, or platform. It was determined by who dared to speak last and meant every word. The summit was no longer a diplomatic exchange. It had become a reckoning on record. What once felt like a panel now felt like a trial with centuries of foreign policy, cultural domination, and rhetorical superiority under cross-examination. And Ibrahim Traoré was the one holding the gavel. Kristi Noem stood still, hands on the podium, the American flag pinned to her blazer. But the usual power that came with that symbol, it felt brittle now. You speak as if you're innocent, she said finally, her tone brittle but burning. As if your governments haven't committed violence, as if your hands are clean. Traoré didn't flinch. No one's hands are clean, he replied. But some keep washing theirs in the blood of others and calling it peace. The crowd froze again. Every sentence of his now felt like a headline. You say we're angry, he continued. We are. You say we're bitter. We are. But we didn't come to be healed. We came to stop being hurt. Kristi's voice rose. You're blaming everyone but yourselves.